Hi, everyone, and welcome. We'll be starting in just a moment. We are letting people come into the room. So we will probably begin in about 1 more minute. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, everyone, to Startup Solutions, how social enterprises are addressing 21st century challenges. My name is Danielle Reed, and I'm deeply honored to be here today representing S&R Foundation at the first ever Nobel Prize Summit. On behalf of S&R and our co-host Halcyon, I'd first like to extend our appreciation to the organizers of the summit, the Nobel Foundation, the US National Academy of Sciences, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the Stockholm Resilience Center for inviting us to design this webinar as a part of their Solution Sessions programming. Our session features a fantastic group of social entrepreneurs addressing some of the 21st century challenges posed by the 3 main themes of the summit: climate change and biodiversity loss, increasing inequality, and technological innovation in support of societal goals. As supporters of these innovators, we were especially moved by the summit's focus on taking action. And as all of you have made the time to join us today, we know you value this focus as well. Thank you for participating in these critical conversations. For our session, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask any questions. We will not be monitoring the chat or using the raise hands feature in this session. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Halcyon's Chief Operating Officer, Josh Mandel.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and terrific to have everybody on our call today, representing over 60 countries on every continent. So really excited to be able to pass the message around about the role that social enterprises play in addressing the challenges that are being focused on as part of this Nobel Prize Summit. Just to give you a quick background on Halcyon. So we basically support social enterprises at their earliest stages of development and throughout their development who drive the world forward and whose ideas drive the world forward. So we see social enterprises as the startups of the future. We've been in operation since 2014. We have over 111 early stage startups in our portfolio from all around the world. We work with them through various types of programming, interaction. We have a residential program where entrepreneurs actually come and live with us for 5 months as part of the first part of their 18-month fellowship. They come from every sector, every part of the world. They cover a wide range of topics. In addition to our residential 5-month program, we have incubator intensive programs that focus on supporting entrepreneurs from specific countries around the world and specific regions. The difference between the Halcyon and your traditional startup incubator, we do not take any equity in the companies. We are a nonprofit incubator. 59% of our founders are women. Over 69% of our founders are founders of color. On the 111 companies that we have in our portfolio, they've raised over $152 million in early stage capital, created over 1,700 jobs, and have impacted over 2.5 million lives around the world. So we chose for today 4 of our portfolio companies based on the diversity of sector, the various stages of development for the company. And just to give you an idea of how we define social enterprise and how we think that these companies are going to be instrumental in changing the world. The goals of this panel are twofold. One is to introduce you to these ventures. They are the focus of the panel, and I look forward to introducing them in a moment. But the second is to have a conversation about the roles that social enterprises are going to play in addressing these 21st century challenges. Governments, large corporations, NGOs, foundations, they all play an absolutely critical role But we're here today to tell you that social enterprises, even at their earliest stage, are going to be the ones that are going to come up with the affordable, deployable, and scalable solutions, which are really going to shape the world and address these 21st century challenges. So really delighted to be part of this conversation. And just a quick plug, we are always looking for dynamic partners around the world to support intensive programs with some top entrepreneurs from their country. So if you have an idea for how you want to expand social enterprise incubation in your country or in your region, please do reach out to Halcyon, and my colleague will be putting the URL for our website so you can contact us accordingly. With that, let me introduce our panelists very quickly. They're going to actually first tell you a little bit about their ventures. We'll launch into some questions, and then I'm going to leave as much time as possible at the end of the panel to take questions from the audience around the world, either to myself and or to the individual ventures. First, I'm going to turn it over to Svanika of rePurpose Global, who is their CEO. Then we'll go on to Sam, to Phil, and then to Sandhya. So Svanika, please tell us a little bit about rePurpose Global.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in. It is an absolute pleasure being here. I'm Svanika Balasubramanian. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at rePurpose Global. We are the world's first plastic credit platform, and we are basically a social enterprise that is making environmental action affordable and accessible to really any purposeful company or business or any individual out there, by allowing them to fund innovators in the front lines of fighting for our planet's future and tackling the plastic waste crisis through the plastic credit platform. So our flagship plastic neutral certification allows you to measure your unique plastic footprint and then set targets to reduce it, and then tackle the remaining amount by funding the removal of an equivalent amount of plastic waste from nature through one of our projects on the ground. So using plastic credits as a financing instrument, today we're funding circular innovations, waste management infrastructure, and plastic recovery efforts across 3 continents in South America, Africa, and Asia. And we're removing about 3 million pounds of plastic waste from nature every single year, and in doing so, positively impacting over 9,000 marginalized waste workers in kind of very affected regions as well. But yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to a very exciting conversation. Back to you, Josh.
Great, thank you so much, Svanika. Let's turn it over to Sam in the Bahamas from Coral Vita.
Hello, everyone. Josh, Halcyon, S&R, thanks so much for having me here in the Nobel Prize Summit. My name's Sam Teicher. I'm the co-founder and chief reef officer of Coral Vita, which is a company that grows coral to restore dying reefs. So I imagine there's a lot of people out there that have never met a coral farmer before. That's certainly not what I grew up thinking I was going to become. I've loved the ocean since I was a kid. I became a scuba diver as soon as I was old enough. And I find the ocean and coral reefs in particular one of the most magical ecosystems on Earth. The thing is, at the end of the day, in addition to the sort of love of nature and biodiversity, they're also one of the most important because they sustain up to 1 billion people's livelihoods in over 100 countries and territories, along with a quarter of all marine life. They reduce wave energy by 97%. They're the best seawalls you can ask for. They power tourism economies, they sustain fisheries, but half the world's reefs are dead. And we're currently on track to lose over 90% in the next 30 years. So this is not just an ecological tragedy, but a socioeconomic catastrophe. And what we do at Coral Vita to try and change the game on this front is we're scaling up coral reef restoration. We launched the world's first commercial land-based coral farming company, where we grow corals up to 50 times faster, so months instead of decades, strengthen the resilience to threats like warming and acidifying oceans, work with local communities, scientists, governments, the private sector, and then sell reef restoration as a service rather than relying on disparate grants and donations, looking at that value around coral reefs, selling restoration to the customers that depend on them, turning our farms into both education centers and tourism attractions, and ultimately hope to launch coral farms in every nation with reefs around the world. I'm calling in from our first location in Grand Bahama, and I'm thrilled to be here with everyone.
Great, thank you so much, Sam, and we're all very jealous of your Bahamian backdrop. Let's turn it over to Phil from Misfit Foods.
Hey everyone, my name's Phil. I'm the CEO of Misfit Foods. Really happy to be sharing this time with you all, and yeah, really excited to hear everything that Sam and Svanika and Sandhya have to say. I think that's a testament to the diversity and to just the really compelling work that S&R Foundation does. And as for Misfit, what we're up to at Misfit is trying to help people eat less meat in order to fight climate change. So pretty simple proposition in that we make products that combine meat and veggies, because here in the United States, the average American eats 220 pounds of meat a year. And so we believe that in order to hasten a plant-forward future, we'd have options for consumers that include, plant-based, like fully plant-based options, as well as blended options. And so we have sausages and ground beef that combine humanely raised meats and nutrient-dense veggies. And we sell those products to retailers throughout the United States. And ultimately, the FAO estimates that about 14% of greenhouse gases are coming from meat and dairy. And so, if we're going to make a serious dent in climate change, the answer has to involve consumers moderating their meat consumption. So yeah, really excited to chat with you all.
Great, thank you very much, Phil. And last but not least, Sandhya from Solstice. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. So my name is Sandhya Murali. I'm co-founder and COO at Solstice. We're based in the Boston area and are working to expand access to clean energy here in the US. So about 80% of Americans can't install solar panels on their rooftops. That's a huge missed market opportunity for a variety of reasons. Either they don't live in their own home, so they don't own their roof, or the roof doesn't face the right way, or they don't have the financial profile to finance or lease a system. And so we are working to expand access to a fairly new form of residential solar called community solar. It allows people to subscribe to a portion of a local solar farm in their area. The power from these solar farms gets sent back to the grid, and subscribers see a credit show up on their utility bill every month. There's no upfront costs, no installations on their property, and so it's a way to get more people plugged into local solar farms and help support more clean energy to our grid. And so at Solstice, we're focused on that entire customer experience of securing projects for people to enroll into, and then focusing on the customer acquisition and ongoing customer management and customer experience. And so we're providing this service to solar developers that struggle with customer acquisition and kind of managing thousands of customers on their solar projects, and connecting people who are looking for ways to save on clean energy to local solar farms. And so we kind of connect the two sides of the marketplace. And we're specifically focused on ensuring that community solar and clean energy savings can reach underserved households and people who've traditionally been locked out of the renewables market. And so we've come up with various ways of addressing some of the systemic barriers that exist for underserved households, namely around credit requirements that you need to participate in the industry. So we've developed what we call our energy score, which we're trying to supplant FICO and in the energy space and figure out how to get more people, low and moderate income households, into the clean energy economy.
Thank you so much, Sandhya. Appreciate it. And so, as all of the participants and attendees can see, this just represents a cross-section of the kind of impact that social enterprises, not just in Halcyon's universe, but around the world, are striving to striving to achieve. So this is an opportunity to ask these individuals questions about how they're achieving their goals, but also learn a little bit more about how social enterprise fit into the broader economy, diversifying economies, and so on. So I'm going to start off, Sandhya, with you, since you finished our introductions. So Solstice was one of Halcyon's earliest founders, actually, from back in 2014. And I'm curious, as social enterprise has evolved over that time, how do you define social enterprise as opposed to a traditional startup? Can you tell us a little bit about your impression of that?
Yeah, sure. So technically, and kind of I think that the main definition of social enterprise is building a financially sustainable business that achieves some sort of impact. And I think when we first started the organization back in 2014, and we were thinking about focusing on this pretty narrow area of the customer experience within the emerging and pretty nascent community solar market, we weren't entirely sure that there was a huge demand for our services. We kind of knew that customer acquisition and management was an issue within the rooftop solar space and deploying access to renewables more generally. But we were still a really young company. We had this bold mission of figuring out how to get community solar into the hands of underserved households, but we still needed to get a paying customer that would say, yes, I'll go pay you to go find customers and to manage them in the software platform that you're building from scratch. Now, about 6 years later, we're very sure and know for a fact that there is a huge market opportunity out there for the services that we're providing. And we're struggling to figure out how to kind of only bring in enough projects that we know that we can confidently fill and find the subscribers for. So the way I define it is knowing that and kind of building a business where there's a clear financial opportunity to actually create a sustainable business and earn money to cover your expenses and kind of reinvest in the company so you can continue to have the impact that you want. And so as we've navigated this market and continue to grow our presence, we're gaining more leverage in the industry with the traditional decision makers and kind of holders of capital in this industry, the developers and financiers of solar projects. And, they need us to go out and find customers and acquire customers. And so as we started to refine our business model and become better at the customer acquisition and management services, we can start to exert more leverage on, what kind of products we want to offer customers and continuing to push the envelope and getting more customer-friendly products, moving away from long-term 20-year contracts, products that have an escalator in there in the structure, making sure we can guarantee savings, making sure we can remove FICO requirements and expand access to renters, to lower and moderate income households, just people who haven't been able to get access to clean energy savings in the past. So that's kind of how I define it. And we know that there's this huge market opportunity. We can build a business out of it. We can raise funding because there's a huge growth potential within community solar. And our goal is to really use that leverage and power that we're hopefully gaining to advocate for the customer, to make sure that we can bring community solar into these underserved populations, into communities of color, into more urban areas, and just really use that leverage to ensure that clean energy is not going to kind of eventually trickle down to communities that have been locked out, but really this transition to a clean energy economy is a just and equitable one. And that's how at least we define it at Solstice. And I think many years after having the generous support of Halcyon, we're actually finally starting to see that take hold.
Thank you, Sandhya. Moving on to Phil, food startups and food social enterprises have been one of the most prolific sectors that we've experienced at Halcyon, both through the ventures that we support and our very large applicant pool. And I think I've learned more about the food ecosystem and how it relates to sustainability and climate change and health and all of the issues that are being covered. Phil, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your vision for the future of food, specifically to how it relates to meat consumption and how that can positively impact our world.
Yeah, Josh, I mean, you just touched on it, right? I think food is at once extremely personal, right? It's a source of nourishment. It's a source of delight. It's, such a cultural touchstone for a lot of people, right? But it's also got this universality in just like the vast supply chain and ecosystem that we need in order to create the food that we're consuming. And so, I think in that vast ecosystem, especially in the United States, over the last, 50, 100 years, we've really prioritized cost and efficiency in developing those supply chains, the policies, the things that we're consuming, all of that. And what's been missing from that equation is really, sustainability. And we're starting to see the consequences of that, particularly in the meat space. And so for me, when I think about the future of food, I'm really looking at just a more balanced future, really, and one that prioritizes plants a little bit more heavily than we're prioritizing meat right now. As I mentioned, the average American eats 220 pounds of meat a year. And that's a really substantial amount. And that has a huge impact, not just on greenhouse gas emissions, but also on the water, the land that gets used into making that food, as well as the welfare of the animals and the humans in the supply chain. And so, I think all of those things, it's a really vast ecosystem. And by being able to eat less meat and also better meat, I think we can make some market improvements on all of that. And right now in the United States, the portion of vegetarians and vegans in the population has stayed relatively flat over the last 20 years. And so if we are going to make a meaningful dent in kind of like the marginal meat consumption, we really need to be talking to the people who are eating, at that average or perhaps even above that average of 200 pounds of meat a year.
Great, thank you, Phil. And moving over to Sam from Coral Vita. A social enterprise that grows coral to restore dying reefs is a truly unique solution for ecosystem restoration. And it's a space that's typically filled by NGOs and academics and government. So just a question to you is why did you choose to launch a commercial entity to protect coral reefs? And how do you actually, in order to scale, how do you get buy-in from governments and stakeholders to deploy your solutions?
Thanks, Josh. It's an interesting space to be working in, to say the least. And I'll be the first one to say that the best thing to do for coral reefs is not to hire us. I would love to get put out of a job. We need to stop killing coral reefs. Our leaders in government and industry and the media need to solve for climate change, overfishing, habitat destruction. That clearly is not happening fast enough or in a meaningful way. And unfortunately, even with the premise that if we were to hit, say, the Paris goals tomorrow, which again isn't going to happen, the ocean is going to keep warming up. And so one of the things that kills corals is spikes in ocean temperatures. So regardless of best case scenario versus worst case scenario, we need to rapidly scale up things like coral reef restoration. For those who aren't familiar, it's kind of akin to reforestation. We grow corals, they then get planted into reefs to bring them back to life. And we use these methods to strengthen the resiliency to threats like warming oceans so that they can actually better survive the threats that they're facing. We were very conscious in doing this as a business. So sort of to the first question about, what is a social enterprise? And we are a social enterprise. We also are a for-profit. Coral farming's been around for about 2 decades, more or less, in terms of the reef restoration space. And it's been shown on a localized scale to bring reefs back to life in the right conditions. But most projects are grant and donation funded. They're super small scale and localized. They grow corals out in the ocean, which is a beautiful day at the office. But these sort of cheap sort of rope or PVC pipe nurseries, they're subject to the whims of the ocean, which ranges from suffering if there's a spike in temperatures, a storm, or a fisherman drops their anchor, to only being able to grow certain species of corals that grow really fast naturally. But many species take decades to reach the size of a dinner plate. And so with that, I had done a coral reef restoration project after college living in Mauritius, where we got a grant from the United Nations. It let us grow 5,000 pieces of corals once. Funding expired, that was the end of the project. And Mauritius alone needs 5 million corals every year. And so my co-founder Gator and I were in grad school, and we were thinking about how the NGO and policy and academia spaces weren't tackling this problem at the pace and scale needed. And we thought, well, reefs are really valuable. On the conservative scale, they generate $30 billion a year. Some very well-respected environmental economists put that into trillions. Needless to say, the loss of reefs is a big economic factor, if nothing else. So our thought was, if we can incorporate breakthrough science, but then deploy a first of its kind business model, that could unlock sustainable funding to do ecosystem scale restoration, to kickstart a whole restoration economy where we're actually paying to protect the ecosystems that we all depend on, rather than just thinking this is up to the NGOs to solve, or a grant should take care of it, because it's not, unfortunately, going to. And so with that, we now are basically proving that out. So we actually just signed our first restoration as a service contract with the government of the Bahamas, and are looking to not only, again, to your sort of the final part of your question, sell the service and get funding from private investors, from customers, from insurance companies, and coastal property owners, and governments, and hotels, but also work with local communities, work with scientists, work with those NGOs, because this is ultimately a team effort to take care of the oceans. And we really need to figure out a way to collaboratively inject a lot more funding into this space, which requires proving out sustainable business models in the world that we live in often, while then doing it in a way that incorporates the communities that depend on these reefs the most and all the stakeholders that rely on reef health.
Thank you, Sam. And turning over to Svanika with rePurpose Global, there are a lot of ventures out there that are attempting to solve the plastic waste problem, and it is a major problem, both in the oceans and terrestrially. I'm interested in your vision for a world without plastic waste. And what are you doing differently that actually hasn't been tried before?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is actually kind of like similar on the topic of what a lot of the other panelists have talked about. So I grew up in Oman. I'm actually here at the moment visiting my parents. So I don't know if you can see behind me, but right there is the Arabian Sea. And Oman is kind of this beautiful country, you know, not very widely known, but just breathtaking, right? And I grew up, I think, you know, on the shores of that Arabian Sea, always, I think, in awe of just how majestic the ocean was and how beautiful the marine ecosystems was. And when I think about, you know, what is my vision for solving the plastic waste crisis, I want what everybody else wants, right? Which is to protect that planet, protect that beauty, and to kind of like do it in the right way. And now, in order to be able to kind of like tackle plastic waste in any sort of meaningful way, I think everybody is looking for that silver bullet solution, right? There's that one breakthrough technology that comes in and suddenly everything is just magically better, but there isn't anything like that. There needs to be, I think plastic is such a ubiquitous material that there needs to be action that's done across the value chain, both upstream and downstream. So we need to be thinking about what can we do to reduce our dependence on virgin plastic usage, to kind of use less plastic, use less material in general, but also in a downstream way. What are we going to do about the plastic that's already out there in circulation? The plastic that is almost unavoidable in certain cases, we still want to make sure that it's not going to leak out into the environment. And so you need solutions that are there like across this value chain. And so I actually did my thesis on this back when I was in college, along with my co-founders, to figure out what those solutions were. So the idea back then was to, you know, say, well, 90% of the plastic waste that we're producing ends up leaking into the environment in some way, shape, or form. Are there not solutions to tackle it? And we went, you know, around the world. We were researching in South America, Africa, Asia, going from dumping ground to landfill, trying to figure out what that answer was. And I remember we were in kind of one of Asia's largest landfills, in India, and we were seeing these kind of mountains of waste, these skyscrapers of just trash, pure trash, just rising up on either side of you, flies everywhere, dogs everywhere, and people, yeah, I think, you know, but today about 2% of the world's poorest people work in informal waste management, which is something that we don't think about often. And finally, the thing that dawned on us was that the problem was not a lack of solutions, but a lack of scale, where you had all of these fantastic solutions that were just kind of very small and localized in nature, and that just couldn't fly anymore, and we just couldn't kind of like depend on them, and we really desperately needed to scale them up. And the missing piece over there was funding, where today there is a $30 billion per year gap between what we need to be investing in our plastic waste solutions and what we are currently kind of investing. And so that's where kind of the idea of plastic credits came into being. So what we're actually doing is we're saying, yes, there are multiple, you know, thousands of innovations ventures out there tackling our plastic waste crisis. What we're going to do is fund them, essentially, using plastic credits as that financing instrument. And the plastic neutral certification is this tool for businesses and companies out there to participate in these solutions in a very easy, accessible way. And so essentially what we're trying to say is we want to put the power and the responsibility back in the hands of the businesses, back in the hands of people that are actually kind of like putting out the plastic out there, and make this a democratic process where we're not just kind of like waiting on governments to come and solve it, but rather kind of like taking action into our own hands, and stepping into the fray and then funding the projects that really matter. And so what we're doing, I guess, differently is, I think, thinking about, you know, saying it's not about kind of reinventing the wheel, but rather scaling it up. So there are solutions out there. How can we kind of facilitate their scale up? How can we catalyze them and help them grow bigger? future, because that's the only way we're going to kind of tackle the plastic waste crisis. Big solutions, broad solutions across the value chain.
Thank you, Smonica. I want us to shift over a little bit to the consumer side of things. You know, one of the reasons that we see social enterprises as the startups and corporations and firms of the future is that consumers are much more aware of the companies that they procure products and services from, and they will in fact pay a premium in some cases to actually work with companies and do business with companies who are doing the right thing for the environment, for society. And so a lot of these solutions are actually quite consumer driven. So Phil, I wanted to turn over to you in the role of food. Can you describe the role that consumers actually play when it comes to creating a more sustainable food ecosystem?
Yeah, Josh, that's a really great question, because ultimately, when you think about food, it is we, the consumers, who are consuming food at the most basic level, right? Like, it's not going to be anybody but us who is eating that food, and therefore in some level responsible for what food we are eating. I think what's interesting about food in particular is that when you compare it to, say, something like cars, where you make, you know, if you're buying a car, you might make that purchasing decision once every, I don't know, 3, 5, 10 years. Food is a daily choice and a daily habit, right? And so, you know, I think the reality is that, yeah, consumption and consumer choices play a very large role and iterated role. I think on the other hand, right, like food producers historically, United States, just haven't really paid for the environmental consequences and costs of their business. And so, you know, I think it would be wrong to say that all of the power lies in consumers' hands, because that's just certainly not the case. But certainly a theme, you know, amongst all of us panelists is that we're driven to look to consumers or to, you know, extra governmental stakeholders, you know, because these kind of multilateral institutions or governments are slow to make solutions and make progress in solutions in our space. That's certainly the case in food. And yeah, so, you know, I think in the United States in particular, like, meat consumption is a fact, but it's not inevitable. It's like meat consumption is quite heterogeneous, you know, across the world. And so, you know, I'm confident that consumer attitudes and shift to consumer attitudes toward meat can make a sizable impact. But that's going to need to be paired with, you know, businesses and governments also making commitments.
Great, thank you, Phil. And just to let all of our participants know, I am getting some really interesting and dynamic questions in the chat. So we are compiling those, and we are going to leave some time at the end to try and address as many of those as possible. So thank you to the audience for being what we'd expect to be for this summit, very curious about what these ventures are doing. And of course, we will provide contact information if requested, so you can follow up with these ventures individually, and or if you have ideas for how to help them continuously scale their solutions. So let me turn it over to Sandhya with Solstice. Look, there are a lot of solar options available. I know for me, I'm getting you know, solicitations on my door on a weekly basis, and calls for basically free solar solutions that exist. But I know that, as you said in the beginning, there are a lot of people which do not have access to those solutions. So with so many of these options available at the household and industry scale, can you tell us, like, from the user perspective, I mean, how does community solar actually work? And does that in fact disrupt mechanisms designed to provide sustainable energy at actually a larger scale?
Sure. So the easiest analogy I can think of is to just think of a large scale community solar farm like a community garden. So imagine, you know, there's an unused, like a warehouse rooftop or a landfill in your local community, in your utility service territory. It's now being repurposed to be a large community solar garden. So it's filled with solar panels. The electricity from that solar farm gets sent back to the grid, and individuals who subscribe to a portion of the solar farm see a credit show up on their utility bill every month. So it is still a grid-based system. Community solar works in deregulated electricity markets. So without getting too into the weeds of how the US electricity systems work, it's present in about 24 states, or the policy that allows for community solar is present in about 24 states in the US. And so majority of our projects are in Massachusetts, New York, and Illinois. And so from the consumer's perspective, it's very simple, right? All you do is, let's say you engage with somebody from the Solstice team. They say, hey, there's a solar farm in your area that you're eligible for, you can sign up for. And so all they do is sign up, and once the solar farm turns on and starts producing power, that customer will have been allocated, say, 5 panels or 10 panels in that solar farm, and the electricity production, the value of the electricity production from their 5 or 10 panels gets delivered to their utility bill as a credit. And so generally customers are saving about 10 or 15% on their annual electricity costs every month. So it doesn't cost anything to sign up. They can save a little bit of money. It's not, huge savings. It's not like they're wiping out their electricity costs, but they can save a little bit of money every month and support more clean energy for their local grid, right? More clean electrons getting pumped into our grid system as opposed to coming from coal or natural gas. So from the consumer's perspective, it's really easy. And as to your question about whether it's disrupting other forms of consumer choices around solar or renewables, community solar is really meant to target the 80% of the population that can't do rooftop at all. So only 1 in 5 households can actually install panels on the rooftop. And so when we encounter people that are thinking, okay, considering rooftop solar, tell me how community solar is different. If they can do rooftop solar, we'll often encourage them to go with it, because if they finance or buy a system outright, they can often save a lot more than they would with community solar. But the fact is that the vast majority of people can't actually do rooftop solar. And so community solar isn't really, I wouldn't say it's disrupting the rooftop industry as much. There's certainly people who prefer community solar because of the ease of signing up and just the ease of getting started. But it's really meant to address this very large percent of the population that just is locked out of rooftop entirely. The other clean energy options that people have that they're sometimes considering can often be layered on top of a community solar subscription. So you could, again, probably getting into a lot of jargon, but you could purchase renewable energy certificates to basically offset your electricity consumption. You could choose an alternative electricity supplier and opt into green energy only for your electricity supply. But all of these things, for the most part, can be layered on top of a community solar product. So it's really something that can complement, someone who's very engaged in their electricity choices or their energy choices. Community solar can be just another kind of option that they opt into. But for most people, and where we see a lot of the barriers, kind of coming back to this question around consumer choice, is that most people have no idea it exists. Nobody's thinking about where their electricity comes from on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of our work is around education and saying, hey, you have the power to choose, or you have this option available to you. Let me explain how it works. And once we do, majority of people will sign up because it is really simple, because it's easy, and we've kind of created a process so that it only takes a few minutes for people to get connected.
Thank you, Sandhya. So I just have one more question for each of the panelists, and then we're going to launch into answering some of the questions from the attendees. Sam, just turning over to you, I know that you have had your fair share, if not more, of challenges, not in the least Hurricane Dorian, which I know presented a pretty significant issue for you all. Novel coral diseases which have been emerging. What, as a social enterprise, as an early stage founder, what do you draw upon for resilience? And in addition to that, what kind of roadblocks are preventing your solution from scaling, if that's the case? And what kind of policies and what are financial leaders doing that have the power to change these kinds of things, but aren't moving fast enough for you?
Well, I'll start with the second question. I think that's the most straightforward. I think every one of us can tell you that fundraising, for any entrepreneur, is definitely not the easiest thing, but certainly for social entrepreneurs, and particularly for early stage social entrepreneurs, there is this massive valley that exists, and it is the most annoying chicken and egg scenario where we've thankfully overcome it. We're fine. So this isn't a pitch for fundraising for Coral Vita, but more on behalf of other social entrepreneurs, where we had so many investors say, we love what you're doing. This is exactly what's needed. We want a business solution for coral reef restoration. Let us know when you're raising a larger round, because then we'll write you a check. And we're like, well, how do we get to a larger round if you're not writing us checks? And I mean, we started off with a $1,000 grant from the university. I appreciate that to write checks, especially from an investor standpoint. There's bandwidth, there's risk, but there needs to be more impact angels. That's just sort of the short answer. I mean, we had one investor who invested in the oceans who's been talking to us for 5 years. He's come to our farm. He's not just, you know, sort of leading us along. He wants to invest, but his minimum check size was $2 million. And our last our raise was for $2 million. So that is just a challenge, I think, that people in finance need to figure out. And when it comes to policymakers, again, as someone who's a strong believer in good, smart government, there needs to be more effort to streamline the process, whether it's for permitting or tax credits or whatever it might be, for social entrepreneurs, for people that are solving problems that normally, as I talked about earlier, are reserved for policy and NGO spaces, that have great solutions that we need, but it takes way too long. In the case of Coral Vita, we moved to the Bahamas for farm number 1 because we were told that the permits to do coral restoration in the Florida Keys, which is a marine sanctuary, and I love the sanctuary, would take 5 years. And it basically took us closer to 5 months to get those permits in the Bahamas. So thinking about from an international and a sub-national perspective, that's what I think can happen there. From the resilience perspective, yeah, from plane crashes to COVID-19, basically wiping out our entire revenue sort of streams, to the strongest storm to ever hit the Bahamas. I mean, our farm is 10 minutes away and it was under 17 feet of water. And I think more than anything, sort of Dorian and everything else that, again, all entrepreneurs go through this, and social entrepreneurs, I think, in particular, go through the realities also of the problem they're trying to solve, and how, you know, daunting that in of itself can be, let alone the stuff that gets thrown your way. I think just really the love for, but also the need we have for nature is sort of my source of resilience. And not even to talk about coral reefs for a second, mangrove forests, like coral reefs, act like seawalls, in addition to all these other benefits. And we were bringing relief supplies out to a community on the far east end of Grand Bahama in the days after the storm. And this one island called Sweetings Key, they got the eye of the storm. They had 200-mile-an-hour winds from 3 different directions. Every person survived. The devastation was catastrophic in terms of the homes, but it was just like, how is everyone like here? We were asking folks, and person after person after person pointed to the mangrove forest that surrounded their island, because it slowed down the waves long enough for them to get to their neighbor's house, to get to the second story. And 20 minutes away in McLeanstown, built the same way, same type of community, most of those mangroves have been cut down, and the death toll was catastrophic. And so as tough as it's been the past, 2020 kind of started in 2019 for me with Dorian, as tough as things have been, as frustrating as it can be to have all these roadblocks and, sudden catastrophes, it sort of just redoubled our commitment to protecting these ecosystems that sustain us all. So that's really where I get a lot of my resilience from. And also to the people that are on this panel. I mean, one of the great things about Halcyon and a lot of the other social entrepreneurship programs, obviously money's great, and like living in the mansion was pretty amazing and all that stuff, but the other social entrepreneurs, learning from them, becoming friends with them, all that stuff is a great source of inspiration that I feel privileged to be a part of.
Thank you, Sam. Svanika, quickly, can you just tell us about your Color for Climate program, which I think it has to do with more representation in the sustainability sector. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So we just launched it earlier this month in kind of honor of Earth Day. And I think, when we're thinking about it, the fact of the matter is that the sustainability crisis, climate change, does not affect everybody equally. You have people of color, young people, economies in the global south that are much more disproportionately affected, that suffer much more adverse consequences as a result of climate change than other people but unfortunately, it is exactly those voices and those stories that are missing from the conversation, that are missing from the mainstream narrative. And you see that a lot, right? I think it was touched on, I think in one of the Nobel Prize Summit sessions, the president of the Federated States of Micronesia was talking a little bit about kind of the devastating effects of climate change on what he's looking at. And you see that time in and time again. But, right now, only 25% of environmental research is actually about the global south. And then you kind of like see so many, statistics out there that are very concerning, where even when you think about socioeconomic inequality, there was some research that came out there recently that talked about how the inequality between the richest economies and the poorest economies are 25% higher now than what they would have been had it not been for global warming. And so you have all of these very obvious kind of consequences, and yet the people who are most affected by it, I think, don't get kind of enough of a voice in the mainstream conversation. And of course, you're seeing this in the numbers, but I think, I'm sure all of us here have experienced it personally as well when we do these things. Oftentimes, in a lot of these panels, I've been kind of the only person of color. Or I remember one of the first kind of panels that I was doing, I was with 4 other people that came in, and they were talking about kind of, introducing themselves and saying, well, I have been working in this sustainability space for 30 years, for 35 years, for 25 years. And I was just sitting there going, well, that's longer than I have been alive. And then, this kind of like, I think, this dissonance between young people, between people of color, and kind of the decision makers over there. So the Color for Climate campaign is, a radical 8-point agenda that we're putting forth to the environmental power brokers of the world at large, from NGOs to governments to social enterprises, to really think about representation and diversity and inclusion as a more crucial component of their roadmap as they go into the future. And one of the cornerstones of the campaign is the idea of a reality seat. And so what we're kind of calling for is this kind of first of its kind reality seat, where we're saying that in every decision-making boardroom, there needs to be a voice at the table that represents the reality on the ground. So that there needs to be a voice of someone who is 35 years or younger, who represents the community that is going to be most affected by the decisions that are being made in that room. And it seems very obvious, right? If you're going to make big decisions, I mean, even in our case, right? If you're going to make big decisions about waste management, you need to be having the people who are going to receive the waste management resources, or who are going to be employed, be part of that solution in the strategy phase itself. And that oftentimes doesn't happen. So that's exactly what we are kind of calling for with the Color for Climate campaign. For all the audiences out there, I'll drop the link in the chat, and you can kind of go take a look at it yourself and support it. And so, yeah, what we're really saying is, intersectionality is so important, and diversity is such an important piece of the sustainability movement. So without including it, the sustainability movement as such will be lost. And so it's really important to kind of think about that as we go forward as well.
Thank you, Svanika. What you can see, one of the themes that has come out in this conversation is the intersection of profit and purpose. And there have been several questions I've seen that have come in the chat as far as how a social enterprise might differentiate itself in that respect. And just to answer directly, one of the questions is, not only are we as Halcyon, looking to invest in transformative ideas, but the impact side and the purpose side of a startup should not be an afterthought or an add-on to the business plan. It really is about integrating that purpose into the DNA of the business. And our theory and what we've seen in our data is that ventures that actually work this kind of impact into their business models are actually going to be more successful in the longer term. And so on that note, Phil, just turning it over to you. I mean, you were, not to embarrass you, but you were recently on Shark Tank. And I know that it is television, and so it doesn't necessarily reflect an actual, a typical investor startup scenario. But given that in a scenario like that, you're dealing with traditional investors who are really looking for return on investment. Does the purpose aspect of your business and in social enterprise in general, does that resonate with traditional business investors? And how does that play out in conversations that you've had with traditional investors?
Yeah, Josh, thanks for that question, and also for embarrassing me. And yeah, I mean, for those who don't know Shark Tank, it's a TV show here in the US, where typically a panel of about 4 or 5 investors, you pitch, they ask you a bunch of questions. It's reality TV, and so yeah, anything can happen really. And Josh, I think what you hit on in sort of like the collinearity of social enterprises, which is to say like that, yeah, that design of purpose and profit going hand in hand, like that was really powerful for us on Shark Tank, because, frankly, the discussion was very different from the one that we're having right now over Zoom, which is to say that it's centered entirely on profit, and less so on purpose. And so, yeah, I think being able to, tailor that message to different audiences is a really powerful tool. And I think ultimately what I was most, I think happiest about, most excited about with the Shark Tank experience was not engaging the investors, but engaging, the 4 million people who were watching the show in their homes. Because if we're going to have serious change in our meat consumption, in our food system, yeah, those people really need to be engaged. And so I think people who, perhaps are less interested in Misfit, for the kind of high-minded purpose that gets me out of bed every day, but more so in the delicious food that we're creating. Like, I think that, joining forces in that way is yeah, that's just, that's what we're all about.
And with no coral reefs, there are no sharks. Therefore, there's no Shark Tank, and then Phil doesn't get funded.
Thank you, Sam, for all your great work.
All right, thanks, Phil. So I'm going to look at pick some of the questions that have come in from the audience. We only have about 6 minutes left, so I'll try and pick ones, and I'll leave it up to the panelists to answer these. But and actually, Sandhya, if you'd like to take this one, there were questions about what is necessary to create ventures that are easily scalable, affordable, and sustainable. And the questioner says, these are so necessary, but also still so rare. So can you talk a little bit about the scalability and affordability that is important in growing a venture?
Yeah, that was probably the toughest question I can come up in the chat. And as we are engaging with investors and prospective investors, it's always, okay, check the box on at least having a viable business model, and check the box on the impact that you're trying to achieve. But scale is kind of that elusive piece of traditional investment that, I think can be harder to achieve in a social enterprise, because you are trying to push forward on these parallel paths of both profit and purpose. I think what we've realized in the last year, especially in this, when it's COVID, where our business model really got turned upside down. A lot of how we do customer acquisition is through community-based partnerships and having boots on the ground and building, really taking kind of the community organizing tenets from the political campaign and bringing that to bear in clean energy. And we couldn't do any of that. All of that just got shut down as of last March. And so we really had to shift around how we run our business. And I think the takeaway from that, which I think is applicable here, is as a social enterprise, or really as a startup, you have to focus on what you can be the best at and partner for everything else. And I think that's one of the ways that we have at least increased our scale over the last year. And we've realized that we can be really good at, once customers are in our system, in our platform, really good at delivering an excellent customer experience, caring about customers, giving them the education that they need to really understand what it is they're signing up for, because most people, as I said before, don't know anything about where their energy comes from, or the fact that they have choices. And we realized that we're not as great at kind of top of the funnel and figuring out how to bring all of these customers into our network. So for that, we decided we needed a partner. So we partner with municipalities. We're trying to partner with larger corporates and larger organizations that can then bring our solution to their constituents, to their members, to their residents. And we partner with other energy companies that have a captive audience and can kind of layer on community solar as one of their offerings. So that's how at least we are approaching this elusive concept of scale. And it really comes down to the basic idea that we're not going to be great at every single thing we try to do. We really need to focus on what we can excel at, and then bring in partners to help us get to that level of scale that we need. And that's at least how we've seen some success. I think COVID really prompted us to take a hard look inside and figure out what it is that we are best at and that we can continue delivering value on.
Thanks, Sandhya. I'm just going to move over to a couple of hyper-specific questions. Svanika, there were questions about whether or not your solution includes microplastics.
Yeah, I think it's a broad question, I think, and I have kind of a broad answer. So we look at all plastics, and I think when we think about plastic recovery and removal, we are thinking about all kinds, right? Plastic isn't made equal. You have the high value plastics, such as your PET and your HEP. You have the very low value ones that are terrible for the environment, such as your MLPs, the multi-laminate, your candy wrappers and chips packets. And of course, you have the microplastics that wash up into the ocean. And so those are actually the hardest to deal with. I think, if you capture the plastic at an early stage, it is much, much easier. So the analogy that I give is, if you kind of come home and you realize your bathroom is flooded, you want to kind of mop up the floor, but you're also going to close the tap first. And so a lot of the solutions that we focus on is kind of like closing that tap and stopping plastic from leaking out into the environment, from becoming microplastics in the first place, as opposed to mopping the floor, which is kind of removing it once it's already there, which is incredibly difficult. So we haven't actually found many solutions that work very well at scale for microplastics. So if anybody out there has ideas, we're always kind of willing to invest in those type of innovations as well. But a big chunk of what we do is one step kind of before that on kind of, stopping leakage in the first place by building enough fences, by building enough infrastructure to stop that leakage in the first place.
Thank you, Svanika. And Sam, there are a lot of questions about how you farm coral on land. And given the fact that there are likely a lot of scientists and engineers and biologists and so on this call, is there a way that you can kind of summarize how you actually do it?
The short answer is there's two ways corals grow: asexually and sexually. Think of it akin to, you can graft take a cutting from a flower or a tree, graft it, or trees and plants pollinate. So corals, again, kind of analogous. We take fragments of corals from out in the ocean and the places we're working, bring them to our farms, which are on land, aquaculture facilities, pumps, running clean seawater through tanks. The corals grow in there for 6, 12, 18 months. We have these methods, as I said before, to accelerate their growth rate so they can get to the size of a dinner plate in months or years instead of decades or centuries, make them more resilient to warming and acidifying oceans, and then they go back out in the ocean to the restoration sites, and we plant them, again, almost like planting trees. We also can breed the corals, throw on a little Marvin Gaye and Barry White, get them in the mood. That's actually really important, jokes aside, for genetic diversity, so that when we outplant them, we're not just monoculturing them. So I don't have time to go into details on that, but that's basically how we do it. And I also saw there's a question about how we make money. I didn't really touch on it too much, but the two core pillars of our business are selling reef restoration as a service to everyone that depends on their tourism, fisheries, coastal protection values, and then our farms being on land are really accessible. So we turn them, one, into community learning centers for fishermen, students, whoever lives in the areas that depend on these reefs the most. So for Bahamians in the case of where we're working now, but then also into tourism attractions where people can have a hands-on learning experience if they're really excited to go out and even pay to plant corals with our team. And in COVID times with no tourism, and also giving people in all times the opportunity to help, you can also like adopt a coral. And so we take all that to then invest into doing ecosystem scale restoration. Josh, you're on mute.
Yeah, it had to happen at least once on this call, right? Okay, so at the end, luckily, thank you, everybody. We are unfortunately out of time. Obviously, we could have an entire summit just with these 4 panelists. It's fascinating work that all of them are doing. Really just want to thank all of them. We love all of our children equally at Halcyon, so it was a very difficult exercise to pick 4, but I think that for the purposes of the summit, giving everybody kind of a cross-sectional view of how social enterprises are changing the world, I really thank the panelists for helping us to accomplish that. There's plenty of information on, including the URLs for all of the ventures in the chat. This conversation will be archived on the Nobel Summit website. We really thank everybody for joining us either very early in the morning or very late at night, depending on which continent you're joining us from. And thank you all very much. This was a really important conversation and I was honored to be a part of it. So thank you, everybody, and have a terrific day, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.